Tonight, Russia says NATO's expansion is a threat to its security. Talks between Russia and the NATO military alliance ended today with no clear promises that an armed conflict can be avoided in Europe's backyard. The two sides are trying to find common ground as concerns grow that Russia is preparing a military invasion of Ukraine. Moscow has already positioned 100,000 troops along its border with Ukraine, and NATO is calling for them to be pulled back. Russia wants written guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO, but NATO says that's up to Ukraine. Here's NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg's assessment of today's meeting.
This was not an easy discussion. We had a very serious and direct exchange on the situation in and around Ukraine and the implications for European security. There are significant differences between NATO allies and Russia on these issues. Our differences will not be easy to bridge, but it is a positive sign that all NATO allies and Russia sat down around the same table and engaged on substantive topics.
Well, following the talks, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko repeated assertions that the expansion of NATO is a threat to Russia.
The main task of NATO's policy and military deployment is to deter Russia, and enormous resources are being allocated for this purpose. Today, many countries have joined NATO, and their territories are obviously used as the basis for projecting power against Russia at strategic depth. That seriously worsens our security and creates an unacceptable risk for us.
For more now, I'm joined by Liana Fix. She's with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Her specialty, NATO-Russia relations. Liana, it's good to have you on the program. Both sides sat down and talked today, but essentially their positions have not changed. So did anyone achieve the seemingly impossible of moving the needle at all today?
I think it was good that the talks took place, but then again, it's better than a military escalation. As you said, the positions seem to be irreconcilable at the moment. There is, however, room for maneuver when it comes to certain security issues in Europe, when it comes to the stationing of missiles, for instance. That is something where NATO signaled it could discuss this further with Russia, but we have to wait what will be the response from Moscow next week after these talks.
And do you think, with NATO saying that it is willing to talk about arms control and missile deployments, do you think that's enough to keep negotiations going?
I think everyone hopes it is enough, but no one, including the Russian delegation at the moment, really knows. It seems that decision-making in Moscow at the moment is really focused on the Russian president, and that only when his diplomats come back from the talks, he will take a decision on whether this is enough, what they delivered, or whether it is not enough and a military escalation might be the path to go for Russia.
And Russia, if you look at the whole story here, we've got Russia basically forcing NATO to the negotiating table by putting 100,000 troops at its border with Ukraine. Do you think Russia is even interested in a diplomatic solution?
I think they're trying to really put everything on the table to get concessions. And again, it is surprising why suddenly these grievances that Russia had for many, many years and has voiced for many, many years now have to be resolved within weeks or months. There has been no obvious trigger. This is a crisis which is created by the Russian side. But again, at the moment, it is almost impossible to say whether the room for maneuver that was found will be enough, or which steps Russia will take.
And what do you think, if push comes to shove here, if we see Russia invade Ukraine, can you imagine the U.S. and NATO actually going to war over Ukraine with Russia?
No, absolutely not. And this is something which has already been made very clear, both by the United States and Europe, that no one will be militarily involved in an escalation. So that is not something to be concerned about. But there is something to be concerned about, which is really the security of Ukraine, which is really Russia's posturing and imperial posturing in the neighborhood. And the United States and Europe have outlined very clearly what the consequences will be of such a Russian intervention: sanctions, support for Ukraine, support for Eastern NATO member states. The question really is if that is enough of a deterrence to bring Moscow back to the negotiation table in the coming weeks.
And isn't what Russia doing right now, isn't it really putting the security situation for all of Europe into question with its actions right now? I mean, it is putting doubt into the minds of leaders at NATO and across Europe right now, isn't it?
Well, there might be some short-term tactical gains for Russia with the approach that it pursues right now, but there will definitely be long-term strategic losses, which is the position of Finland and Sweden, for instance, which already have signaled that they will independently decide whether they plan to join NATO or not at some point in the future. It is also, you can also see signs in Eastern European countries which demand more reassurance measures, more troops in their countries. So again, this Russian posturing is creating an even greater backlash in Europe and by those countries who feel threatened.
Liana Fix with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. We appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you. I'm now joined by our correspondent Terry Schultz in Brussels. She is following the talks for us. Good evening to you, Terry. So what are your sources telling you? How did these talks go today?
Brent, the amount of relief that we saw among NATO officials after this meeting took place just goes to show how low expectations were and how big the concerns were that they might not take place at all. Remember, the Russians had threatened to possibly not even show up for these talks if they didn't feel like the Monday meeting with the United States in Geneva went well. So the very fact that they held these talks, that the Russians stayed at the table even longer than expected, the meeting went on about an hour longer than we had been told to expect, that all added up to a good sign for NATO that the Russians were actually or may actually be willing to discuss these issues.
We heard the Russian negotiator after those talks with the U.S. on Monday say that Ukraine can never, ever be allowed to join NATO. So where's the room then for negotiation on that?
On that, there isn't any room for negotiation, and the Russians are fully aware of that, even as they say it. This is something that doesn't just involve Ukraine. It also would involve any other country wanting to join NATO in the future. Georgia, of course, is on that list, and both Ukraine and Georgia have been promised that they will be allowed to join NATO. This really isn't something that NATO is even going to consider, and the Russians know that fully well. They just want to sort of put their red lines very, very starkly laid out, and then perhaps walking back from that makes them look like they're being reasonable. But this is truly an issue on which there's no discussion.
DW's Brussels team spoke to Britain's junior foreign minister today, James Cleverly. I want you to take a listen to part of what he told us.
I and others made it very clear that an invasion of Ukraine would be a terrible strategic mistake, that there would be repercussions, and that there is a high likelihood that Russia will be drawn into a quagmire, a long-standing and painful conflict that would see Russians lose their lives and Ukrainians lose their lives. This is in no one's interest.
In no one's interest. So how real is the possibility of a military conflict, Terry? If Russia were to invade Ukraine, what would a NATO response look like? Do we know?
Well, Ukraine isn't a NATO member, as is also clear. And so NATO as an alliance is not ever going to go defend Ukraine. But countries bilaterally, the United States has made it clear that it would not stand idly by if Russia were to invade Ukraine. Other NATO allies would also provide support and have been providing support to Ukraine. They've been selling lethal military equipment. They've been training Ukrainian forces. And one analyst I spoke with, Jim Townsend, even believes that the U.S. should step up this aid, should actually put more U.S. soldiers in Ukraine for training purposes, just to warn the Russians that they better not step over that line, because, of course, you take aim at an American and then it's all over. So truly, there are discussions about what more to do to bolster Ukraine, but there wouldn't ever be a NATO response at 30 allies.
I want you to take a listen also to what the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman said today after the talks with NATO and Russia concluded.
The United States and our NATO allies were united in our responses to Deputy Foreign Minister Grushko and Deputy Minister of Defense Fomin and their comments, including when it comes to certain core Russian proposals that are simply non-starters. Together, the United States and our NATO allies made clear we will not slam the door shut on NATO's open door policy, a policy that has always been central to the NATO alliance.
Now, Terry, as we were saying, there were separate talks on Monday between the U.S. and Russia. Should we read anything into that? I mean, is the U.S. fully in lockstep with NATO, or is Russia trying to play these two off of each other?
Well, remember, Brent, that when the talk about having these discussions first came up, the Europeans absolutely did not want the U.S. and Russia to hold bilateral talks. That was a demand of the Kremlin, and it was something that the Europeans felt weakened their negotiating position. Now, the United States did ultimately agree to hold those bilateral meetings in Geneva, but you've seen just this enormous outreach to the Europeans by Wendy Sherman and by other U.S. officials to keep talking to the Europeans right up until the last minute they walked into those bilateral talks. Then Wendy Sherman came to Brussels yesterday and spent all day debriefing NATO allies, debriefing European Union officials, meeting with the top leadership in the EU as well as in NATO, even before heading into these NATO-Russia talks now. So the U.S. is definitely trying to keep true to its word that it won't discuss anything about Europe without Europe, anything about Ukraine without Ukraine.
We've just had 4 years of the Trump administration wanting to disengage with NATO, getting, if you will, chummy with Russia. Has that left any permanent scars at NATO?
I think it has, and just this outreach. I mean, honestly, almost too much outreach. It sometimes seemed like, more than 100 meetings or something like this. This is partly a legacy of the Trump administration, where the Europeans had no clue from day to day, except by looking at Twitter, what the U.S. policy might be. And the Biden administration is very much trying to make up for that and keep the Europeans on board and keep the Europeans reassured. That's in the U.S. interest. As well as the Europeans' interest. So, yeah, I think that all of this communication is partly a legacy of the Trump administration, both for the U.S. benefit and for the Europeans as well.
DW's Terry Schultz with the latest tonight from Brussels. As always, Terry, thank you. On Thursday, Russian diplomats will meet with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, a third day that will wrap up this week's attempts at finding a diplomatic solution to this crisis. All of this talking may sound like background noise for people who are living in eastern Ukraine. For nearly 8 years, Ukrainian forces have been fighting a Russian-backed separatist insurgency, a conflict that has cost more than 14,000 lives. Now, with 100,000 combat-ready Russian troops just over the border, people live in fear of an imminent invasion. DW correspondent Nick Connolly traveled to the frontline city of Donetsk to talk about the prospects for de-escalation.
Just before the shooting starts, you see the cats and dogs taking cover. It's like they can feel it's coming.
Here on the front lines near Donetsk, gunfire and shelling are part of everyday life and have been for the past 8 years. For the stray animals, the Ukrainian soldiers and the few civilians left.
There's still people living there and over there. Beyond that, there's no one, just the front line.
Most of those left are elderly and have nowhere else to go. Russian-backed separatists are only a few hundred meters away from these Ukrainian positions, close enough to watch each other cooking or chopping firewood. We arrived just a matter of minutes after the last exchange of fire. The Ukrainians say both sniper activity and drone attacks have spiked in recent weeks. As the world tries to second-guess Vladimir Putin's troop build-up on Ukraine's borders, the soldiers here understand that they would likely be the first to bear the brunt of an invasion.
Of course, we're following the news closely, but whatever happens, our army is in much better shape than in 2014. Russia would face a lot more resistance. It's the civilians out there who are getting really nervous.
You see that power line? Our troops are 30 meters behind it. They managed to push their positions forward a bit.
When we first met Katya and her children in 2017, the fighting was even closer. Back then, the front line started where her garden ended. Today, she tells us, is a good day. No shelling, only machine gun fire.
I go on walks with the kids round the village and we hear machine gun fire in the distance. We just do our thing. We're not scared.
Katya's 3 children have grown up knowing nothing but conflict. Now, as all-out war seems ever more likely, she's weeks away from giving birth to a 4th. She knows most people couldn't imagine bringing up a family in a place like this.
For better or worse, this is my village. I know all the paths. I know where to hide if the bombing starts. I know what will protect me. If I can drop into a ditch in time, I'll survive.
But after sticking it out for years, even Katya is now making plans to leave. Back at the front lines, I asked Alexander if he thinks Russia will get its way and keep Ukraine out of Western alliances.
NATO membership is not going to happen anytime soon, but I think in the end they'll take us. A lot has changed in this country, and so have we. The Russians have done everything they could to convince us that they're not our brothers, to make us turn our backs on them.
And for now at least, Russia seems to be in no mood to try to win back Ukrainian hearts and minds.